The wood under my bare feet was rough, splinters. Not that it mattered now. The sun beat down like a punishment, a hot hammer against the back of my neck. The air in Red Bluff was thick, tasted of dust and sweat and something ugly, something like expectation. I kept my eyes down, stared at the grime on my toes. If I looked up, I'd see them, the whole town, gathered in the square like it was a holiday. I could feel their eyes on me, hundreds of them, not with pity, not even with anger really, just hungry. They were hungry for a story to end, my story. Just a heads up before I start telling this story. Someone in it is about to make a choice that will change their life forever. If you think you know what it is, comment choice below. And do not click away from this video. The final 5 minutes will change how you see everything. The mayor was talking. His voice was a sharp, important sound that sliced through the heavy air, but the words didn't stick. They were just buzzing flies, circling something already dead. That something was me. He was talking about justice, about order, about making an example of a girl who'd forgotten her place. My place. My place had been a small room behind the Reverend's house. My place had been scrubbing floors and praying to a God who felt as distant as the moon. My place was supposed to be safe. It wasn't. My throat was a canyon of dust and stone. A scream had tried to climb out of it days ago. It had failed. Now it was just a rock, lodged deep, choking off every word I ever knew. They said I was silent out of guilt. They were wrong. Silence was all I had left. The memories came not like a flood, but like shards of broken glass in my mind. The smell of stale whiskey, sharp and sour. His breath, hot on my cheek. His laugh, a wet, ugly sound in the darkness of the storeroom. The splintering crack of a bottle against the edge of a crate. Not my hand, his. And then the weight of him. The tearing of my dress. The feeling of my own fingernails digging into the dirt floor, trying to pull myself away. And the silence that followed. A terrible, ringing silence, where a man's life had just bled out onto the floorboards. My silence. I blinked, and the storeroom was gone. I was back on the gallows. I risked a glance. Just one. Through the haze of my own fear, I saw him. Reverend Thornon, my adoptive father. The man who'd taken me in when I was nothing but a skinny orphan found by the river. He stood near the edge of the crowd, head bowed. His hands were clasped so tight his knuckles were white. His face was gray, not with grief for me, but with shame, a deep, heavy shame that bent his shoulders. He taught me the Lord's Prayer. He taught me my letters. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He wouldn't speak for me. Not then, not now. The faith he'd preached about every Sunday had crumbled to dust, right here in this square. A man with a limp and a shiny badge stepped forward. The sheriff. He smelled of cheap liquor, even from here. He held the noose in one hand. The rope was thick, oiled. It swayed a little in the dead air, like a snake, patient, ready. This was it then. The end of the story. Elara Vance, 19 years old, hanged for a murder she didn't commit, with a throat too full of terror to say a single word in her own defense. I closed my eyes. I was tired, so deeply tired. Let it be over. But it wasn't. A sound cut through the stillness. Not a shout, not a gunshot. Hoofbeats, steady, unhurried, deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythm was wrong. It didn't belong to this town of nervous energy and quick violence. This was something else, something ancient and sure. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a shifting of weight. Heads turned. I opened my eyes. He rode in from the east, a silhouette against the bleeding sun. No hat, no badge, just a man on a horse. His hair was long, braided with leather. His skin was the color of the earth he rode on. He dismounted with a quiet grace, his boots making almost no sound in the dust. He walked his horse right into the center of it all, right to the foot of the gallows. The whole town held its breath. The mayor opened his mouth to object, but no sound came out. The stranger didn't look at the sheriff. He didn't look at the mayor. He didn't look at the noose hanging above my head. He looked right up. He was looking at me. His eyes held me. They weren't like the other eyes in this town, the ones that were either filled with hate or just plain empty. His were still. They were like looking into a deep, dark well, and you couldn't see the bottom, but you knew there was water down there. Life. He saw me, not the torn dress, not the bruised cheek, not the girl they called a killer. He saw Elara. And in that moment, for the first time since they'd dragged me from that storeroom, I wasn't entirely alone. The mayor, a man named Cutler who puffed out his chest like a fat pigeon, finally found his voice. "Who in the hell are you?" he squawked, his face turning a blotchy red. "You have no business here. This is official town justice." The stranger didn't even turn his head. His gaze stayed on me. "I am Lone Hawk," he said, and his voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It was a low, rough sound, like stones rolling in a riverbed. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Of the Nakone band." A shiver went through the crowd. Comanche. The name was a curse and a ghost story in these parts. The sheriff took a half step back, his hand twitching near the gun on his hip. "And I invoke our right," Lone Hawk said, his voice dropping even lower, making every person in that square lean in to hear. "The girl is owed the trial of arrows." Trial of arrows. The words meant nothing to me. They sounded like just another way to die. Maybe slower, maybe worse. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I swayed on my feet, the whole dusty world tilting on its edge. "Trial of what?" the sheriff barked, trying to sound brave. "There's no such thing in Red Bluff. The law is the rope, and she hangs at dawn." At that, Lone Hawk finally turned. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that made the sheriff's bluster look cheap and clumsy. He faced the lawman, and though he was leaner, he seemed to take up more space, to have more weight. "Then your town needs reminding of its debts," he said, each word chosen, each word placed like a stone. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. But his words were heavier than any threat. They spoke of things older than Red Bluff, of promises made in blood and honor, not on paper. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. You could have heard a pin drop in the dust. And then, another voice cut through it. A voice I knew all too well, a voice that should have spoken for me days ago. "He speaks the truth." Every head swiveled. Reverend Thornton stepped forward from the crowd. His face was still gray, still etched with that terrible shame, but his eyes were on Lone Hawk, and for the first time, they held a flicker of something other than fear. He was trembling, but he stood a little straighter. I knew his mother," the Reverend stammered, his voice thin but clear in the sudden quiet. "Years ago, near Dodge, some drunken cavalrymen, they were going to hang her. For nothing. For sport." He took a ragged breath. "I cut her down. I gave her my horse." He looked at Lone Hawk, a strange mix of awe and terror on his face. You are her son." Lone Hawk gave a single, slow nod. "She never forgot the man of God who saved her from a noose. She taught me that a debt of life is the heaviest debt of all. It must be repaid." He turned his dark eyes back to the mayor. "I am here to repay that debt. I claim her. She is owed the 3 days." The mayor looked like he was about to choke on his own indignation. He looked at the sheriff, who just shrugged, his face a confused mask. He looked at the crowd, and he saw not the bloodthirsty mob he'd commanded moments ago, but a sea of uncertain, whispering faces. The story was changing. The simple tale of a Mexican girl who killed a soldier was becoming something else, something more complicated, something they couldn't control. My mind was spinning. A debt, a life for a life, his mother. And then a memory, thin as smoke, surfaced. A woman with dark, kind eyes hiding in the church cellar. A wound on her arm. Me, just a girl of 12, bringing her water and a clean bandage. I had touched her shoulder, a clumsy gesture of comfort, and then ran, spooked by the secrecy of it all. I never saw her again. I hadn't known. "This is ridiculous," the mayor sputtered. "Pagan nonsense." "It is honor," Lone Hawk replied, his voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "And if we refuse?" the sheriff asked, his hand still near his gun. Lone Hawk's gaze settled on him. It was not a hot glare, but a cold, heavy weight. "Then I will bring my people's law to your land," he said, his voice quiet, deadly. "And no man from Red Bluff will cross Comanche soil without paying a toll, in blood." It was a promise. The kind that settled in your bones. The kind that made the sweat on your skin turn cold. This wasn't a trial for me anymore. It was a trial for the whole town of Red Bluff. The mayor swallowed hard. You could see the calculations in his eyes. Scandal. An Indian war. Bad for business. He looked at the gallows, then at me, then at the unmoving Comanche warrior. He was trapped. "Fine," he snapped, the word cracking like a whip. 3 days. 3 days of your superstition. But at dawn on the 4th day, if no proof is found, the sentence is carried out, no matter what. Lone Hawk nodded once, a gesture of finality. 3 days is all the truth needs. He then walked towards the gallows, towards me. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at me. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone and shadow. "You don't remember me," he said, not a question, but a statement. His voice was softer now, meant only for me. "When you were a girl, you brought bandages to a woman hiding in the church cellar. You told her she had kind eyes." The breath caught in my throat. The memory, so faint before, became sharp, clear. "That was my mother," he said. "You touched her shoulder, and then you ran. You never saw her again." He took a step closer, his eyes holding mine. "Your father once gave my mother back her life. I am here to return the debt." My lips parted. No words came out. The rock was still there, heavy in my throat. But for the first time, a single, tiny crack appeared in it. Hope. It was a terrifying, painful thing. It felt a lot like breathing after you've been held underwater for too long. The noose still swayed above me, a patient serpent in the dying light. But for now, it would have to wait. They didn't take me back to the dusty cell. They led me out of town as the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. It felt strange to walk on my own 2 feet, even with the deputy on either side of me, their hands hovering near their pistols. My wrists were raw where the rawhide had been, but the freedom of movement was a shock to my system. The air tasted different out here, away from the stench of fear in the town square. It smelled of sagebrush and cooling earth. We walked toward a jagged spine of rock that clawed at the sky, a place the locals avoided. They called it the Wind's Teeth. The name felt right. The rocks were sharp and twisted, like the broken teeth of some great dead beast. As we drew closer, I could hear it, a low, moaning sound. The wind funneled through the narrow canyons, whispering in a language only the land understood. This was to be my courtroom. A small group had followed us. The mayor, the sheriff, Reverend Thornan, and a few others from the town, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and suspicion. They stood at a distance, huddled together like nervous sheep. Lone Hawk stood alone at the mouth of the stone maze. He held something in his hand, a single white feather, long and clean, taken from the wing of a hawk. It looked impossibly fragile against the harsh landscape. "This is the first trial," he announced, his voice carrying easily on the wind that was now beginning to rise. "The first arrow. Wind." He turned his gaze to me. She must walk the maze, alone, from one end to the other. She must carry the feather. If fear breaks her and she turns back, the arrow fails. If she drops the feather, the trial ends. One of the deputies snorted. Walking in the dark? That ain't no trial, that's a death sentence. There's rattlers in there. Mountain cats. The wind does not lie, Lone Hawk said, his voice cutting through the man's complaint. It asks nothing of her but truth. Her own spirit will be her guide and her judge. He walked over to me and held out the feather. My hand trembled as I reached for it. It was lighter than air, yet it felt as heavy as a stone in my palm. I looked from the feather to the dark, gaping maw of the canyon. The wind was a physical force now, pulling at my torn dress, whipping my hair across my face. It felt alive, angry. If you carry nothing else, Lone Hawk said, his voice low for me alone, carry this with courage. I couldn't speak. The rock in my throat was solid, but I met his eyes and nodded once. A single jerky motion. He stepped back. There was no ceremony, no farewell, just a silent expectation. This was my path to walk. I took a breath that felt like swallowing sand and I stepped into the maze. The temperature dropped immediately. The sound of the wind grew louder, a chorus of shrieks and whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. The path was narrow, the stone walls closing in around me. Within 20 paces, the last of the twilight was gone. I was plunged into a deep, profound darkness, broken only by the faintest sliver of a moon high above. My first instinct was to scream, to turn and run back to the light, back to the familiar faces, even if they were faces that wished me dead. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. The deputy's words echoed in my head. Rattlers, cats. My bare feet scraped against the stone. I stumbled, my hand flying out to brace myself against the wall. The rock was cold, rough, and unforgiving. The feather trembled in my other hand. I could feel the delicate barbs vibrating with the force of the wind and with my own shaking. Drop it, a voice in my head whispered. Just let it go. It's over. No more trials, just the rope. Quick, simple. But then another image pushed its way through the fear. The image of Lone Hawk's eyes, the stillness, the silent belief. He hadn't looked at me like I was a condemned woman. He'd looked at me like I was a warrior. I tightened my grip. My knuckles were white. No. I pushed off the wall and took another step, and another. I moved slowly, one hand trailing along the stone wall to guide me, the other holding the feather tight against my chest. The wind was relentless. It tore at me, trying to rip the feather from my grasp. At one sharp turn, a sudden violent gust slammed into me, stealing my breath. It ripped the thin shawl from my shoulders. I felt it fly away behind me, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The path twisted and turned. Sometimes it narrowed so much I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. Once it opened into a small circular chamber where the wind swirled like a cyclone, disorienting me, making the whispers sound like they were coming from inside my own head. I sank to my knees, pressing my forehead against the cold stone, just for a moment, to find my center. The feather was still there. I could feel it against my skin. I don't know how long I was in there. An hour, a lifetime. My body was numb with cold. My feet were cut and bruised. Every muscle ached with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in my bones. I was running on nothing but pure, stubborn will. I was nearing the end. I could feel it. The air was changing again, a subtle shift, and then I saw it. A faint, pale light ahead. The exit. Relief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. But the maze wasn't finished with me yet. As I rounded the final turn, the corridor narrowed into a tight bottleneck, and a solid wall of wind hit me like a physical blow. It was a scream made of air, a force that threw me back against the rock. My feet slid out from under me. I went down hard on one knee, my head bowed, my body trembled uncontrollably. The feather was crushed slightly in my grip, but I still held it. I squeezed my eyes shut, and for a moment, I gave in. The sheer exhaustion was too much, but then, through the howl of the wind, I thought I heard his voice again. Carry this with courage. With a gasp that was half a sob, I pushed myself up. My legs were shaking violently, but they held. I lowered my head, leaned into the wind, and pushed my way through those last few feet of shrieking darkness. And then, I was out. I stumbled into the open, blinking against the moonlight. The group was still there, silent shapes on the ridge. The wind here was just a breeze, soft and gentle. No one cheered, No one spoke. The silence was absolute, but Lone Hawk was there. He stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to a large, flat stone and placed a folded piece of cloth on it. It was dark with moisture. Water from his own canteen. I saw it. I saw the offering. I walked on unsteady legs to the stone. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely pick it up. I pressed the cool, wet cloth to my forehead, to my cracked lips, to the dust and grime on my cheeks. My eyes slid shut. A long, shuddering breath escaped my lungs. And then the tears came. Not tears of fear, or pain, or even relief. They were silent, deep tears for something that had been broken inside me and was, just maybe, starting to heal. When I looked up, my vision blurred. I met Lone Hawk's eyes across the clearing. No words were spoken. None needed to be. The first arrow had held. We gathered again at dusk the next day. The wind had died down, but the memory of it still clung to my hair and clothes. My legs ached. My feet were a mess of cuts and bruises that I tried to clean as best I could. My whole body felt like one big, tender bruise. But as I walked into the town square, I held my head a little higher. I had walked through the dark, and I had come out the other side. Something inside me had shifted. The fear was still there, but it wasn't in charge anymore. The town was quieter tonight. The crowd was smaller, the mood different. The open mockery was gone, replaced by a sullen, watchful silence. They had seen me walk out of the wind's teeth. They didn't understand it, and that made them uneasy. Lone Hawk stood in the center of the square. Beside him, placed in the dirt, was a single thick candle, its wick already lit. The small flame danced, a tiny, defiant spark in the growing darkness. In his hand, he held the second arrow. It was a slender shaft of wood, wrapped in bright red thread and tipped with a piece of obsidian that glinted like a shard of night. "The second trial," he announced, his voice a low counterpoint to the crickets just starting their evening song. "The second arrow. Fire." A nervous murmur rippled through the onlookers. He looked at me, his face serious in the flickering light. "She will sit by this flame until the sun rises," he explained, his gaze sweeping over the crowd and then returning to me. "Her hand must remain above it, not in it, but above it, close enough to feel the spirit of the flame. If she quits, the trial ends. If the flame goes out, the arrow breaks." The deputy who'd scoffed the night before laughed out loud, a harsh, grating sound. "A staring contest with a candle? What kind of damn fool trial is that? What's next? You gonna make her chase a rainbow?" More laughter followed, but it was hesitant, uncertain. It died out quickly. Some of the townspeople, especially the women and the children who peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, weren't laughing. They were just watching, their eyes wide. I knelt in the dust beside the candle. The ground was hard and cold. My hands trembled as I lifted my right one, the one that wasn't holding a phantom feather anymore. I spread my fingers, palm down, and held it over the tiny flame. The heat was immediate, not a searing pain, but an insistent, probing warmth that traveled up my arm. It was a living thing, this heat. It demanded attention. My eyes fluttered, my first instinct to pull away, but I held steady. My jaw was set so tight my teeth ached. Lone Hawk stepped back, sinking into a low crouch several feet away. He became part of the shadows, a silent guardian. He said nothing. He did nothing. He just watched. The hours crawled by, each one a separate eternity. The town square emptied out as people went to their dinners, their saloons, their beds. But then, they would drift back, one by one or in small groups, to check, to see if I was still there. Some came to sneer, their whispers like the hiss of snakes. Others were just curious. They'd stand in the shadows for a while, silent, then slip away again. The sheriff paced nearby for a time, his limp more pronounced, his face a mask of contempt. Reverend Thornton stood at the edge of the street, a solitary figure holding a book he never opened. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. I could feel his gaze on me, heavy with guilt and a strange, reluctant pride. My hand did not waver. To keep my mind off the growing discomfort, I focused on the flame. I watched the way it danced and swayed. I watched the wax melt, forming little rivers that trickled down the side of the candle and pooled at its base. The flame was my whole world. Around midnight, a gust of wind, a ghost of the trial from the night before, swept through the square. The flame bent low, almost winking out. A collective gasp came from the few shadows still watching. My heart leaped into my throat, but before the flame could die, Lone Hawk was on his feet. He moved without a sound, placing his body between me and the wind, his long cloak creating a shield. The flame flickered, struggled, then straightened, burning bright and steady once more. He held his position until the gust passed, then returned to his crouch without a single word. He wasn't just my judge. He was my protector. The children came back. One by one, they crept out, peeking from behind barrels or from the dark alleyways. Their parents had put them to bed, but curiosity was a stronger force than sleep. They whispered to each other, their voices carrying in the quiet night. "Is she praying? Does it hurt? Why is she doing that, Papa?" Their parents would shush them, pulling them back into the darkness. But the questions hung in the air. They were questions no one in Red Bluff had bothered to ask before. The hours before dawn are the coldest, the darkest. My body was screaming. My knees were bruised and raw from kneeling in the dirt. My shoulders slumped forward with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing me into the earth. The heat from the candle was no longer just a warmth, it was a constant throbbing pain. A large blister had formed across the base of my fingers, angry and red. My hand trembled, not from cold, but from sheer muscle fatigue. Still, I held it there. The candle was small now, a stub of its former self. The flame danced lower and lower, a tiny, guttering soul. Just before the first hint of grey light touched the eastern sky, my arm began to shake uncontrollably. My eyes, gritty and red, welled with tears. Not of fear, not even of pain anymore, but of an exhaustion that went bone deep. I was failing. After everything, I was going to fail. My hand faltered, dipping dangerously close to the flame. Then, he rose. Lone Hawk walked toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. The second arrow was still in his hand. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He raised the obsidian-tipped arrow. For a terrible second, I thought he was going to use it on me, a final mercy stroke. But he didn't. He touched the sharp black tip gently to his own chest, right over his heart. "Your pain," he said, his voice a low hush that still seemed to fill the entire square, "honors truth." I looked up at him, my arm still raised, my hand still burning. His dark eyes held mine, and in them, I saw not a judge, but a witness. He saw my struggle. He was acknowledging it. He was giving it meaning. "You do not have to speak to be heard," he added, his voice so quiet it was almost a thought. A tear broke free and traced a clean path through the grime on my cheek. At that exact moment, as if in response to his words, the candle flame, which had been nearly dead, suddenly flared bright. It burned with a fierce, clean light as the first ray of sunlight broke over the adobe rooftops. I lowered my hand. The flame still lived, the second arrow still held, and somewhere, deep inside the wreckage of my soul, so did I. The final morning dawned with a heavy hush, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The air was cool and clean. We didn't gather in the town square this time. Lone Hawk led me, along with the mayor and the few townspeople who had followed this trial to its end, to a small, secluded clearing just outside of town. A ring of stones had been laid on the ground, and in the center, a small fire of cedar branches burned low, sending a fragrant gray smoke into the pale sky. I stood at the edge of the circle. My body was a symphony of aches. My hand was a throbbing testament to the night I had endured. But I felt strangely calm, grounded. I had walked through wind and sat through fire. I had been stripped down to nothing, and somehow I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. My hands, though scarred and raw, did not shake. Lying across a flat, clean stone was the third arrow. Blood. It was different from the others. Beside the arrow shaft lay a small, ceremonial blade. The handle was made of bone, worn smooth with age, and the sheath was leather, dyed with red ochre and marked with symbols I didn't understand. The blade itself wasn't large. but it gleamed with a dull, dangerous light. My blood ran cold. This was it. The final test. They were going to bleed me. Lone Hawk stepped into the circle. He picked up the sheathed blade. His movements were slow, reverent. "This is the final trial," he said, his voice low and firm, directed at the silent onlookers, but his eyes were on me. "The arrow of blood." He paused, letting the weight of the word settle. "Not to spill," he continued, and my heart gave a painful lurch, "but to trust." He drew the blade from its sheath. It was beautiful and terrifying. He held it flat in his palm, the metal catching the morning sun, and then he extended it to me, handle first, an offering. "If you are guilty," he said, his voice clear and steady, "you will fear the truth that lives in your own chest. Your hand will tremble. If you are innocent, you will hold this blade to your heart, and it will not waver." I reached forward. My fingers, blistered and scraped, grazed the smooth bone of the handle. For a heartbeat, I paused. Not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of reverence for what was happening. This wasn't about proving my innocence to them. It was about claiming it for myself. I took the knife. The circle was utterly silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Somewhere beyond the trees, a hawk cried out once, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the stillness and then vanished. I turned the blade in my hand. Its edge looked sharp enough to cut the wind. I looked at Lone Hawk. His face was a mask of concentration. His belief in this ritual, absolute. He believed in me. Slowly, I raised the knife. I placed the flat of the cold blade against my chest, right over my heart. I could feel its chilly weight through the thin cotton of my dress. I closed my eyes. My hand was rock steady. My breath was even. My heart beat a slow, strong rhythm against the steel. Thump, thump, thump. I was not afraid. In that moment, I was empty of fear. I was ready. Whatever the spirits judged, I was ready. And then, a scream ripped through the sacred quiet. "Stop!" It wasn't a man's voice. It was raw, ragged, filled with a desperate agony. Heads turned. A figure stumbled out from behind a thicket of mesquite trees at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, thin and gaunt, her dress torn, her hair matted with dirt and leaves. She looked like a ghost, a wraith pulled from a shallow grave. The sheriff instinctively put his hand on his gun. "Who in the hell are you?" he demanded. Lone Hawk moved without thinking, stepping protectively between me and the newcomer. But the woman held up a shaking, filthy hand. "I have to speak," she rasped, her voice cracking. She coughed, a dry, rattling sound, then seemed to find a hidden reserve of strength. She stood straighter, her eyes, wild and fierce, fixed on the sheriff. "My name is Annabel Glay," she said. "I was married to Private Thomas Glay. The man this girl is accused of killing." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. The mayor stepped forward, his face a picture of disbelief. "You were presumed dead. Your husband said you ran off, that you were taken by—" "My husband lied," she snapped, and the venom in her voice was startling. "He lied about everything. He beat me. He beat other women. And that night I followed him, because I knew he had his knife." Her wild gaze shifted, landing on me. Tears welled in her eyes, carving clean tracks through the dirt on her face. "I saw him drag her into that barn. I saw her try to fight. I saw him raise the knife to her throat." She looked down at her own trembling hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "And she choked on a sob. "I stabbed him. With a piece of a broken crate. Not her. It was me." The world tilted. The air rushed from my lungs. The knife in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. It was me. The words echoed in the stunned silence. "I ran," Annabel whispered, her voice breaking completely. "I was so afraid. No one would ever believe a broken woman over a soldier. I hid in the hills. I've been living on roots and fear. But when I heard what they were doing to her, these trials, I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let an innocent girl hang for my sin. My eyes widened. A single tear, hot and stinging, slipped down my cheek. I was still holding the blade to my chest, my hand still steady. But now, I held it with a new understanding. Not just for myself, but for this broken woman who had carried my guilt, and her own, in silence. The mayor was speechless. The sheriff took a step back, his hand falling away from his gun. Lone Hawk turned to the mayor, his face grave. 3 sons, he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. 3 truths. This is the final one. He gently took the ceremonial blade from my numb fingers and, with a powerful, fluid motion, drove it point first into the earth in the center of the stone circle. It stood there, quivering. Her blood is clean, he declared. Annabel Glay crumpled to her knees in the dust, her body racked with sobs. She reached a trembling hand toward me. I'm so sorry, she wept. I'm so sorry. I looked at the knife in the ground. I looked at the broken woman before me, and I knelt beside her. The rock that had been lodged in my throat for so long, the stone made of fear and pain and unscreamed screams, it simply dissolved. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, my lips parted, and I spoke. My voice was a dry, broken whisper, a sound like rustling leaves. But in the dead quiet of that morning, every soul in that circle heard it. Thank you. The walk back to town was different. The silence was still there, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. It was a hollow, echoing silence of shock. Annabel Glay walked between the sheriff and his deputy, her head held high, her tears finally dry. She was a prisoner, but she looked more free than anyone I had ever seen. No one looked at me. It was as if I had become invisible again, but in a new way. I was no longer an object of scorn or a spectacle for their entertainment. I was something inconvenient, a living, breathing reminder of how wrong they had been, a testament to a justice they didn't understand and a truth they had refused to see. The mayor officially declared the sentence null and void from the courthouse steps, his voice flat and monotone, eager to have the whole affair finished. The rope was cut down from the gallows. It fell to the dusty platform with a dull, unsatisfying thud. The show was over. The crowd dispersed quickly, quietly, avoiding each other's eyes. Some people cast furtive glances my way, a mixture of pity and fear. I had completed their trials, but I didn't belong to them. I never had. Reverend Thornon approached me, his face etched with a decade's worth of regret. His steps were slow, hesitant. Elara, he whispered, my real name sounding strange on his lips. My child, I failed you. Can you ever forgive? He reached for me, his arms open, wanting to pull me back into the familiar fold of his protection. A protection that had been absent when I needed it most. I froze. For a moment, my body was rigid. I didn't pull away, but I couldn't lean in. That part of me, the part that was his daughter, had died on that gallows platform. I took a small, deliberate step back, breaking the contact before it could even begin. The hurt in his eyes was a sharp, painful thing to see, but it was a necessary pain. A clean break. Goodbye, Reverend, I said, my voice still rough but steady. My gaze swept over the emptying square, searching. I found him. Lone Hawk stood where he had been all along, by his horse, watching me. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He simply waited. His eyes held no triumph, no challenge, no, I told you so. They held only a quiet, open invitation. An invitation to a world without walls, without judgment. I knew, in that moment, what I had to do. My past was here, in this town of dust and shame. My future was standing over there, waiting. I started walking toward him. Each step felt momentous. It was a choice. My choice. The few remaining townspeople parted for me, their whispers following me like smoke. She's going with him? After everything? She's an Indian lover now. The words were sharp, but they couldn't cut me anymore. They were just noise. I reached his side. He didn't speak. He just looked down at me, his dark eyes asking a silent question. I gave him my answer. I reached out and placed my hand, my blistered, scarred, and finally free hand, into his. His fingers closed around mine, his grip warm and strong and sure. It was more of a vow than any words could ever be. We turned, together, and began walking out of the square, away from the gallows, away from the church, away from the life that had almost been the death of me. A small girl, the blacksmith's daughter, tugged at her father's sleeve as we passed. "Papa," she asked softly, her voice carrying in the quiet air. "Is she free now?" The big man looked from his daughter to my retreating back. He saw me walking tall and steady beside the Comanche warrior who had honored my silence. He nodded once, a small but certain gesture. "Yes, darling," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She is." We didn't look back. The seasons turned. The high desert sun gave way to the sharp winter wind and then softened again into the sweet breath of spring. A year passed. The town of Red Bluff, with its ghosts and its gallows, became a distant memory. A story that felt like it had happened to someone else. Lone Hawk and I crossed the river and never returned. We built a new life, not in a town, but in a quiet hollow where the cottonwood trees bent low over a slow-moving stream. Our home was a small cabin, just one room with a roof that I helped thatch myself and a stone hearth that kept us warm through the long winter nights. Life here was measured not by clocks or church bells, but by the rising and setting of the sun, by the needs of the earth. I planted a garden, herbs for healing, wildflowers for beauty. My hands, once soft and useless, grew calloused and capable. The silence that had once been a prison became a comfort, a space to think, to heal. I learned his language, not all of it, but enough. He taught me the names of the stars and the tracks of the animals. I taught him to read the words in a worn copy of Shakespeare that the Reverend had given me years ago. We rarely spoke of Red Bluff. We didn't need to. The past was a scar we both carried, but we didn't live there anymore. In the mornings, children would come. Children from the Nakone village downstream, and even a few white children from the hardscrabble homesteads nearby whose parents had heard the story and decided to trust the woman who had walked through fire. I taught them their letters, writing in the dirt with a stick. I taught them that questions were more important than answers. One afternoon, as I sat with the children under the shade of a large cottonwood, a little Lakota girl with eyes as bright as obsidian beads looked up at me. "Are you his wife?" she asked, with the blunt honesty only a child possesses. The other children went quiet, their own curiosity piqued. Lone Hawk was nearby, sharpening an arrow, pretending not to listen, but I saw his hands still. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes. I looked over at him, then back at the little girl. "I am no one's wife," I said, my voice gentle, "but I belong where I am seen." The children seemed to accept that. It was an answer that made sense to them. Later that evening, as the sky turned the color of a fading bruise, Lone Hawk and I stood on the bluff overlooking our small valley. The wind, my old adversary, was now a friend, cool and soft against my face. He held 3 arrows in his hand. He had made them himself. One was fletched with the white down of an eagle. One was bound in red thread. The third was bare, dark wood, but tied at its base was a small, frayed strip of old rope, a piece of the noose that had once waited for me. He didn't have to say anything. I understood. I took the white-fletched arrow from him. "For wind," I whispered, holding it in both hands before placing it in the small fire he had built on the rock. He handed me the second one. "For fire," I said, my voice a little stronger, as I laid it next to the first. Finally, he offered me the last arrow, the one with the piece of the noose. I looked at him. He nodded. "For blood," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The blood that was not spilled." I placed it on the flames. We didn't need a law. We had a promise. We knelt there together, watching the arrows burn. The flames curled upwards, consuming the wood, the feathers, the threads, the piece of rope, turning them into smoke and ash that the wind carried away into the vast, starry sky. "Justice," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost part of the wind, "is not made in courts. It is made in what we dare to protect." The fire danced in his eyes. The space between us was full of memory, of shared silence, of a quiet, unshakable certainty. I reached out and touched the faded scars on my wrist. "I'm not who I was," I said softly. He placed his warm hand over mine. "And yet," he said, "you never stopped being who you are." As the last arrow burned to ash and the embers glowed like a constellation on the rock, we stood. The wind rose, not harsh but warm, like a breath, like a blessing. In that space between what had been and what could be, we had chosen. Not survival, not vengeance, not even hope. We had chosen presence, love, not as ownership but as reflection. Justice, not as a verdict but as a witness. And Elara Vance, once silent beneath a noose, now stood beneath the stars, unclaimed, unbroken, and finally, completely seen. The dust of Red Bluff has settled. The fire in the sacred circle has burned to ash. And we are left with the silence. Not the terrible, choking silence of fear, but the deep, reflective quiet that comes after a powerful story has been told. Elara and Lone Hawk's journey is more than just a tale of the unforgiving West. It's a mirror. And if we're brave enough to look into it, we'll see our own world, our own struggles, reflected in its surface. So, what do we take with us from that dusty town and the open plains beyond? What are the lessons that ride with us long after the story ends? First, let's talk about silence. How many of us have stood on our own gallows? Maybe it wasn't a wooden platform, but a boardroom where our ideas were shot down, a family dinner where our truths were unwelcome, a relationship where our needs were ignored. In those moments, we often fall silent. Elara's silence wasn't emptiness. It was a cage built by trauma, a prison where her voice was the captive. We all have those prisons. We stay quiet out of fear, fear of judgment, fear of conflict, fear of not being believed. The first lesson from Elara's story is that your voice has value, even if it's broken. It took 3 grueling trials for her to find hers, and when she did, it was just a whisper. Thank you. 2 small words that carried the weight of a world. The lesson isn't that you must shout to be heard. It's that you must honor your own truth, even if you're the only one who can hear it at first. The first step out of that silent prison is often just a whisper to yourself. This isn't right. I deserve better. I am not what they say I am. That is your first arrow. Hold on to it. Next, there is the profound difference between being looked at and being seen. The entire town of Red Bluff looked at Elara. They saw a Mexican girl, a sinner, a murderer. They saw a spectacle, a problem to be disposed of. They saw a label that fit their prejudices. Lone Hawk saw her. He looked past the dirt and the fear and saw the truth of her spirit. He didn't see a label. He saw a soul. We live in a world of red bluffs. In an age of social media profiles, headlines, and snap judgments, we are constantly being looked at, categorized, and labeled. We are reduced to our job titles, our political beliefs, our relationship status. We are judged on a single photo, a clumsy tweet, a momentary mistake, and the weight of being constantly looked at but never truly seen is crushing. The lesson here is twofold. First, we must have the courage to be Lone Hawk for others, to look past the easy labels and make a genuine effort to see the person underneath, to listen when it's easier to judge, to offer a hand when it's easier to walk away. But just as importantly, we must learn to value ourselves enough to seek out the people who truly see us. Your tribe is not the crowd that gathers for the spectacle. Your tribe is the one person who walks through the noise, looks you in the eye, and sees your truth without you having to say a word. Find your Lone Hawk, and be one for someone else. Then there is the lesson of true strength. The mayor and the sheriff had power. They had loud voices, badges, and the force of the law. Their strength was brittle, built on fear and control. It shattered the moment it was challenged by something it didn't understand. Lone Hawk's strength was different. It was quiet. It was rooted in honor, in a promise kept, in an unshakable inner code. Ilara's strength was different still. It was the strength of endurance, the strength to walk through the wind, to sit through the fire, to hold the blade to her own heart without flinching. It was the strength of survival. We are taught that strength is loud, that it's about winning the argument, having the last word, dominating the room. This story teaches us that true strength is often silent. It's the resilience to keep going when you are exhausted. It's the integrity to stand by your principles when no one is watching. It's the courage to be vulnerable and to trust. Strength isn't about the noise you make when you arrive. It's about the ground you refuse to give up when the storm hits. Finally, and perhaps most hopefully, there is the lesson of the debt. The entire story, the salvation of Elara, the humbling of a town, all of it hinged on one single act of kindness performed years earlier by a flawed man who had long since forgotten it. Reverend Thornon, in a moment of courage, cut a woman down from a noose. He saved a life. And that act sent a ripple through time that came back to save the life of the daughter he was too afraid to protect himself. It's a powerful reminder that the good we put out into the world doesn't just disappear. It matters. The small act of compassion, the word of encouragement, the moment you choose kindness over cruelty, you may never see the outcome. You may never know the life you touched or the future life that person will go on to touch. But nothing is wasted. We live in a cynical world that tells us to look out for number one. This story whispers a different truth, that we are all connected, and that a debt of kindness is the only currency that truly matters in the end. It is the only thing that can, quite literally, save a life. Elara's story is a map. It shows us that our red bluffs aren't always towns of dust. Sometimes they're our own self-doubt. Our trials aren't always of wind and fire. They're of loss, burnout, and heartbreak. But the path to freedom is the same. It is the path of quiet courage, of finding those who truly see us, and of trusting that the good we do matters. It is the path of choosing not survival, not vengeance, but presence. The choice, in the end, to be unclaimed, unbroken, and finally seen. If this story moved you, if the courage of Elara and the honor of Lone Hawk stirred something deep inside you, then you belong here with us. This isn't just a channel for stories. This is a digital campfire. A place where we remember that justice isn't always found in a courtroom, but in the courage of a single voice. Where love isn't about ownership, but about seeing someone for who they truly are. We believe that the stories of the quiet, the outcast, and the forgotten are the ones that hold the most power. They are the stories that remind us of who we can be when we are at our best. If you believe that too, then join our tribe. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the heart of the human spirit. This is our circle. This is our fire. And there is always a space here for you. Thank you for being a witness. Until next time, stay strong and stay seen.